Shadows of Memory. A Detective Marcus Stone Mystery, Book 2. 3 months had passed since Marcus Stone cracked the Devereaux diamond case, but the victory felt hollow. The city had moved on. Newspapers had found fresh scandals. The police department had new crises to manage, and Detective Stone was left with a scar across his temple and a reputation that preceded him like a warning. He sat in the evidence room at 2 a.m., surrounded by boxes from the Kowalski investigation. The diamonds had been returned, the insurance fraud exposed, the corrupt chief imprisoned. But something gnawed at him, a splinter in his mind that wouldn't dislodge. "Can't sleep either?" Detective Rivera appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She'd been his anchor through the aftermath, the only person he'd trusted when his memories were fragments and his world was shadows. "Kowalski's sentencing is tomorrow," Marcus said, accepting the coffee. "Should feel like closure." But it doesn't. She knew him too well. "You're thinking about the cold case I showed you, the Morrison diamonds?" Marcus nodded, pulling out the file he'd memorized. Different year, different victim, same pattern, stage theft, insurance payout, housekeeper dead under suspicious circumstances. The case had been buried in Harrison's desk, marked unsolved, but never actively pursued. Kowalski couldn't have been operating alone this long. Someone taught him the pattern, someone bigger. Rivera studied the photographs, evidence photos that looked eerily familiar despite being 15 years old. "You think we've only scratched the surface?" "I think we've been investigating symptoms, not the disease." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Catherine Devereaux waited in the lobby, her designer suit unable to mask the weight of recent months. Prison had aged her husband, Victor. Guilt had aged her differently. "Detective Stone, I need your help." Marcus led her to an interview room, noting how she unconsciously chose the chair facing the door, a habit of the perpetually guilty. "My son David had a safety deposit box we didn't know about. The bank contacted me after everything settled." She slid a key across the table. "I can't face going alone. Not after what I helped do to him." Marcus felt the familiar stir of detective instinct. David Devereaux, the pawn in his mother's scheme, the witness to murder, the young man whose evidence had helped crack the case. Even in death, he was still providing pieces to a larger puzzle. They drove to First National Bank in silence. The safety deposit box was smaller than expected, but its contents made Marcus's pulse quicken. A leather-bound journal, a flash drive, and a photograph of David with a woman they'd never seen before. The woman was in her 50s with kind eyes and protective posture, her arm around David like a mother shielding her child. On the back of the photo, David's handwriting, with Mrs. Morrison, 2019. "She knows the truth about them all." Asterisk. Mrs. Evelyn Morrison. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. The Morrison diamond case, the cold case from 2019, the one that mirrored the Devereaux theft perfectly. According to police records, Evelyn Morrison had died of a heart attack 6 months after the robbery, but David's photo was dated after her supposed death. They opened the journal first. David's meticulous handwriting documented months of investigation. "Mrs. M isn't dead. She faked her death to escape them. The same people who killed Mrs. Chen are responsible for her husband's murder. They call themselves the Jewelers. They've been operating for decades. Insurance fraud, diamond substitution, murder when necessary. Kowalski was just their latest recruit." The flash drive contained video files. David interviewing a very much alive Evelyn Morrison, her face gaunt but determined, detailing a criminal organization that spanned 3 states in 2 decades. "They have people everywhere," Evelyn said in the video, her voice carrying the weight of genuine fear. "Police, insurance companies, even the FBI. They teach each other the patterns, cover for each other when things go wrong. Harrison was small-time compared to the others. You need to find the ledger. It has every name, every payment, every murder." Marcus called Rivera immediately. "We need to meet. Bring everything you have on unsolved diamond thefts from the last 20 years. They convened in his apartment, spreading cases across every surface like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. The patterns emerged with disturbing clarity, Diamond thefts where housekeepers or security guards died under mysterious circumstances, cases that went cold after initial investigation, insurance payouts that seemed excessive. 23 cases, Rivera breathed. 23 deaths that were ruled natural or accidental, all connected to diamond thefts. David's journal provided the roadmap. He'd been investigating the jewelers for months, using his gambling debts as cover to infiltrate their lower ranks. He'd learned about the ledger, a physical book where the organization recorded every member, every payment, every crime. Mrs. M knows where it is, David had written, but she's scared. They killed her husband when he tried to expose them. They killed Mrs. Chen for knowing too much. They'll kill me too, but maybe not before I get the evidence to someone who can stop them. The final entry was dated the day before David disappeared. Going to meet Stone tomorrow. He has no idea how big this is, but he's the only cop I trust who isn't dirty. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead, but Mrs. M is still out there. Find her, find the ledger, end this. Finding Evelyn Morrison became their top priority. David's journal mentioned she was hiding in the old neighborhood, but that could mean anywhere. Then Marcus remembered something from the original case file. Evelyn had grown up in Riverside Heights, a working-class neighborhood that had resisted gentrification. They started with the church. St. Monica's had been Evelyn's childhood parish, and David's journal mentioned she'd been devout. Father O'Brien remembered her fondly. Evelyn moved away after her husband died, the priest said carefully, but his eyes held knowledge he wasn't sharing. Father, we know she's alive. We know she's in danger. The people who killed her husband are still out there, and they've killed others since. The priest studied them for a long moment. She comes to early mass sometimes, 6 a.m., when no one else is here. Sits in the back, leaves before the homily. I never ask questions, but she mentioned someone named David, said he was a good boy trying to make amends for his family's sins. They returned the next morning at 5:30 a.m., finding Evelyn Morrison kneeling in the last pew, her silver hair hidden under a scarf, her posture that of someone who'd learned to be invisible. She saw them and froze, ready to run, but Marcus spoke quickly. David sent us. He left evidence. We know about the jewelers. We know about the ledger. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of relief that her long vigil might finally be over. They met in the church basement, surrounded by the mundane artifacts of community life. Folding chairs, coffee urns, bulletin boards announcing bake sales and prayer groups. Evelyn Morrison looked like a different woman from the society matron in old newspaper photos. Thinner, harder, but with a core of steel that decades of fear hadn't eroded. I told David not to trust anyone, she said, clutching a coffee cup like a lifeline. But he said you were different. Said you'd been hurt by them too. Marcus showed her David's journal, the photograph, the evidence they'd compiled. She touched the photo gently, tears falling freely. He was a good boy, tried to save his mother from herself, tried to make things right. They killed him for it, didn't they? We believe so, just like they killed Mrs. Chen, just like they killed your husband. Evelyn nodded, unsurprised. They've been doing this for 40 years, maybe longer. They find wealthy families with financial problems, offer them a way out, stage a robbery, collect insurance, split the profits. Anyone who gets in the way disappears. She pulled out a small key from around her neck. Safety deposit box, First National Bank. Different branch from David's. The ledger is in there, along with photographs, recordings, financial records going back decades. I kept it as insurance, but I was too scared to use it. Why now? Rivera asked gently. Because David died trying to protect me. Because Mrs. Chen was my friend. Because I'm tired of hiding while they keep killing people. She straightened her shoulders. And because I think you might actually be brave enough or crazy enough to stop them. The safety deposit box was larger than David's, its contents meticulously organized. The ledger itself was impressive. Leather-bound, filled with precise handwriting documenting decades of crimes. But it was the supporting evidence that made Marcus's detective heart race. Photographs of the jewelers' meetings, audio recordings of planning sessions, financial records showing payments to corrupt officials. The organization has tiers, Evelyn explained. The core, 5 families who've been doing this since the 70s. The associates, people like Kowalski who handle specific jobs. And the facilitators, corrupt cops, insurance adjusters, lawyers who make the problems disappear. She pointed to a photograph showing 5 well-dressed couples at what appeared to be a charity gala. The core, they meet twice a year, rotate leadership, keep their distance from the actual crimes. That's how they've stayed hidden so long. Marcus recognized some faces. A federal judge, a state senator, a prominent defense attorney. People with enough power to make investigations disappear, enough connections to ensure their organization survived exposure of individual members. But they're not invulnerable, Evelyn continued. They need the ledger to keep track of everything, to ensure fair distribution of profits, to maintain control over their members. Without it, they can't function. They'll do anything to get it back. Including murder, Marcus thought, including attacking a detective and leaving him for dead in an alley. The ledger wasn't just evidence. It was a death sentence for anyone who possessed it. They moved Evelyn to a safe house immediately, an FBI facility that Rivera had connections to through her former partner. But even as they processed the evidence, Marcus felt the familiar itch of an incomplete puzzle. If the ledger is so important, why didn't they move it after your husband died? Why leave it in a safety deposit box they could access? Evelyn smiled sadly. Because they don't know it exists. My husband was the ledger keeper, the one person responsible for maintaining the records. When he died, they assumed the current version died with him. They don't know he taught me the system, that I continued keeping records. So when they killed him, they thought they were destroying their paper trail, but I kept it going, added their murders to their list of crimes. Every theft since his death, every bribe, every killing, it's all in there. Rivera looked up from photographing documents. We need to move fast. Once they realize we have this, they'll come after us with everything they have. But Marcus was already thinking several moves ahead. Not if we make them think we don't have it. Not if we let them believe their secret is still safe while we build a case they can't escape. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was the only way to ensure the jeweler's complete destruction rather than just another round of arrests that left the organization intact. Their first target was the weakest link, a jewelry appraiser named Leonard Cox, who'd been falsifying documents for the jewelers for 15 years. Cox was a small man with smaller ambitions, content to take his cut and maintain his comfortable life. Marcus approached him carefully, using Rivera's identity to arrange a meeting about insurance appraisal services. Cox's office reeked of fear and expensive cologne, his hands trembling as he sorted through gemstones that might or might not be real. Detective Rivera, what a pleasure. How can I help the police department today? Marcus stepped from the shadows, watching Cox's face drain of color. Actually, Mr. Cox, I'm the one who needs help. You see, I've been having memory problems lately. Sometimes I forget important things, like which diamonds are real and which are excellent fakes. Cox's hand moved toward a hidden button, but Marcus was faster. I wouldn't. The people you're thinking of calling, they can't help you anymore. But I can, if you're smart enough to take the deal. What deal? Full cooperation, names, dates, evidence. In exchange, witness protection, immunity for your cooperation, and a chance to start over somewhere the jewelers can't find you. Cox wavered, fear warring with self-preservation. They'll kill me. They're going to kill you anyway, Leonard. The only question is whether you die as a loose end or live long enough to testify against them. Cox's cooperation provided the breakthrough they needed. He confirmed Evelyn's story about the core, identified current associates, and most importantly, revealed that the jewelers were planning their biggest job yet. The Pemberton collection, Cox whispered, as if saying the name too loudly might summon its owners. 50 million in diamonds and rare gems. They're going to hit it during the charity gala next month. The Corps is handling it personally. First time they've been directly involved in years. Why this job? Rivera asked. Because they're scared. With Kowalski arrested and Harrison in prison, they think the organization is exposed. This is their retirement fund, one last big score before they disappear. Marcus felt the familiar surge of hunter's instinct. The Pemberton collection was famous. Diamonds accumulated by a mining fortune over 3 generations, displayed publicly only once a year at their foundation's charity gala. Security would be massive, publicity would be intense, and any theft would dominate headlines for months. But it was also the perfect trap. If the jewelers were desperate enough to risk everything on one job, they might be desperate enough to make mistakes, especially if they believed their secrets were still safe. "We need to warn the Pembertons," Rivera said immediately. "No," Marcus countered. "We need to let them try. We need to catch them in the act, with evidence that will destroy them completely. This isn't about stopping one theft, it's about ending an organization." Convincing their superiors required a delicate balance, revealing enough to get resources while concealing enough to maintain operational security. They went to Assistant Chief Patricia Monroe, Harrison's replacement, and a woman with a reputation for integrity that even the jewelers hadn't corrupted. Monroe listened without interruption as they laid out the evidence. The ledger, Cox's testimony, the pattern of crimes spanning decades. When they finished, she was quiet for so long, Marcus wondered if she'd understood the scope of what they were proposing. "You want me to authorize a sting operation involving a $50 million diamond collection, multiple corrupt officials, and an organization that's allegedly been operating since before you were born. You want me to risk innocent lives and political fallout on the chance that you can catch them in the act?" "Yes, ma'am. And if you're wrong, if they don't show up, or if they realize it's a trap, or if someone gets hurt because we didn't take basic precautions, then I'm wrong, and I'll accept the consequences. But if we're right, we don't just stop a theft. We dismantle an organization that's murdered 23 people that we know about." Monroe studied the ledger, running her fingers over the meticulous records of corruption. "My predecessor is in prison because of this case. Half the department is still under investigation. If this goes wrong, we'll all be wearing orange jumpsuits." She closed the book with finality. "But if it goes right, we'll have done something that matters. You have your operation, but I'm assigning FBI liaison and full tactical support. This isn't just a police matter anymore. It's a federal case." The Pemberton Foundation Gala was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to prepare a trap that would either destroy the jewelers or become the biggest embarrassment in law enforcement history. Marcus threw himself into the planning with obsessive focus, using his recovered memories of previous operations to anticipate every possible complication. They established a command center in an abandoned building across from the gala venue, an historic hotel that would host 500 of the city's wealthiest philanthropists. Every entrance was covered, every staff member vetted, every security camera fed into their monitoring system. But the real challenge was ensuring the jewelers believed the job was viable while secretly controlling every variable. They needed to make the collection accessible enough to attempt the theft while maintaining plausible security that wouldn't arouse suspicion. "We leak information about security gaps," Rivera suggested. "Make them think they found vulnerabilities we don't know about." Marcus nodded, already thinking several moves ahead. "And we give them an inside man, someone they think is working for them, but is actually working for us." They recruited a hotel security guard with a gambling problem, someone whose financial difficulties would make him attractive to the jewelers while remaining loyal to law enforcement. It was a dangerous role, but Officer James Patterson volunteered without hesitation. "My brother was killed during a robbery 3 years ago," Patterson explained. "Case went cold, no arrests, no answers. If these people are responsible, I want to help take them down." As the operation developed, Marcus found himself thinking about memory. Not just his own recovered memories, but the collective memory of an organization that had survived by ensuring no single person knew enough to destroy it. The jewelers' genius wasn't their criminal sophistication, it was their ability to compartmentalize information. Each member knew only their role, their contacts, their immediate responsibilities. The Corps maintained control by being the only ones who saw the complete picture. Until Evelyn Morrison and her husband had begun keeping the ledger, comprehensive records that documented every crime, every payment, every participant. It was the organization's Achilles heel, The one piece of evidence that could unravel decades of careful planning. But it was also bait. Marcus knew that the jewelers would eventually discover the ledger's existence, if they hadn't already. When they did, they would move heaven and earth to recover or destroy it, which made it the perfect lure for their trap. "We leak controlled information," he told Monroe during their daily briefing. "Let them know we have evidence that could expose them, but make them think it's incomplete, fragments that need the ledger to make sense." "You're using yourself as bait," Monroe observed. "I've been bait since the day they attacked me in that alley. The difference is now I know the game, and I'm playing to win." The first sign that their plan was working came in the form of surveillance reports. Unknown vehicles appeared near the safe house where they'd moved Evelyn. Unfamiliar faces showed up at Leonard Cox's usual haunts. Someone was looking for the ledger. "They're testing our defenses," Rivera reported, reviewing footage of a man who'd spent 3 hours watching the safe house from different angles, "trying to determine if we know what we have, if we understand its significance." Marcus recognized the watcher from Evelyn's photographs. Anthony Castellano, the Corps' enforcer, a man whose legitimate business interests couldn't explain his presence at multiple crime scenes over 2 decades. "Let him look," Marcus decided. "Let them think we're guarding something precious without understanding its true value. The more confident they are that we don't know what we're holding, the more likely they are to proceed with the Pemberton job." But confidence was a double-edged sword. The jewelers' strength came from their belief in their own invulnerability, the conviction that their organization was too sophisticated, too well protected to face meaningful consequences. Challenging that belief meant risking a desperate response. Evelyn understood this better than anyone. "They're like cornered animals when they're scared," she warned during one of their encrypted video calls. "Smart enough to be dangerous, desperate enough to be unpredictable. Don't underestimate what they'll do when they realize how exposed they are." The Pemberton collection arrived at the hotel under massive security. Armored trucks, armed guards, media coverage that ensured everyone knew exactly when and where the diamonds would be displayed. It was exactly the kind of high-profile target the jewelers preferred, exactly the sort of challenge that would draw the Corps out of hiding. But it was also a fortress. The display cases were reinforced ballistic glass, the security system integrated with hotel infrastructure, the guards vetted through multiple agencies. Any attempt to breach security would require inside knowledge, careful planning, and precise execution. Perfect conditions for the jewelers, who specialized in making the impossible look effortless. Marcus spent the week before the gala walking through the hotel, memorizing every corridor, every exit, every potential hiding place. He met with hotel staff, security personnel, event coordinators, building relationships that might prove crucial when the operation began. He also met with James Patterson daily, ensuring the undercover officer was mentally prepared for the dangerous role he was playing. Patterson's job was to provide the jewelers with the inside information they needed while secretly feeding law enforcement their plans. "They approached me last night," Patterson reported 3 days before the gala. "Made contact through my gambling connections. They know about my financial problems, know I'm working security at the hotel. They want to meet tomorrow." This was it, the moment when their plan would either succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically. The meeting took place in a warehouse on the city's industrial outskirts, the kind of anonymous location that hosted transactions best conducted in shadows. Patterson wore a wire so sophisticated it was undetectable to standard scanning equipment, while Marcus and Rivera monitored from a surveillance van 3 blocks away. The man who met Patterson was professional, efficient, clearly experienced in criminal recruitment. He identified himself only as Mr. Smith, but his voice matched recordings of Anthony Castellano attempting to disguise his speech patterns. "We understand you're experiencing financial difficulties," Smith began without preamble. "We also understand you're working security at the Pemberton Gala. These facts might be complementary." Patterson played his role perfectly. Desperate enough to be tempted, cautious enough to seem credible, smart enough to ask the right questions. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Information, access codes, security schedules, response protocols, nothing that would directly implicate you in any Irregularities. Simply knowledge that might prove valuable to interested parties. And if I'm not interested in helping interested parties, then you continue struggling with debt, working overtime, hoping for a promotion that may never come. Or you consider alternative revenue streams that might provide immediate relief for your financial pressures. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, ending with Patterson agreeing to provide general information about hotel security in exchange for enough money to clear his gambling debts. It was the opening the jewelers needed, and the trap Marcus had been waiting for. Tiwam, the information Patterson provided was carefully crafted, accurate enough to be valuable, incomplete enough to require the jewelers to reveal their methods. Security schedules that showed gaps they could exploit, access codes that would work but trigger silent alarms, response protocols that seemed vulnerable but actually funneled intruders into controlled areas. They're planning to hit the collection during the charity auction, Patterson reported after his second meeting with Smith. When everyone's attention is focused on the ballroom, they'll access the display area through the service corridors. They need 15 minutes to bypass security, substitute the real diamonds for fakes, and exit without triggering alarms. It was an elegant plan, exactly the sort of sophisticated operation the jewelers were known for. But it was also exactly what Marcus wanted them to attempt. Every movement would be recorded, every participant identified, every crime documented for prosecution. The night before the gala, Marcus visited Evelyn Morrison at the safe house. She looked stronger than she had in months, her long exile finally approaching its end. "Tomorrow it ends," she said simply. "One way or another, the jeweler's reign is over." "If everything goes according to plan," Marcus cautioned, "plans are for people who control their own destiny. We've done everything we can do. Now we find out if justice is stronger than corruption." The night of the Pemberton gala arrived with the kind of anticipation that preceded major sporting events or political elections. The city's elite gathered in their finest attire, diamonds glittering against designer gowns, expensive watches catching the light of crystal chandeliers. Marcus watched from the surveillance center as guests arrived, each face compared against their database of known jewelers' associates. The core members would be present. The Pemberton collection was too significant for them to delegate completely, but they would be disguised, hidden among legitimate guests until the moment of the theft. "Visual confirmation on Castellano," Rivera reported, highlighting a figure in the ballroom footage. "He's posing as a reporter from the society pages. Camera equipment provides perfect cover for surveillance equipment." One by one, they identified the core members, each playing a role, each contributing to the complex choreography of the planned theft. The organization that had operated in shadows for decades was finally exposing itself to the light. But Marcus knew that identification wasn't enough. They needed evidence of criminal intent, proof of conspiracy, documentation of the actual theft. The operation required precise timing and perfect execution. Any mistake could result in the escape of criminals who would never be this vulnerable again. "All units in position," the tactical commander reported. "We have eyes on all exits, control of all communication systems, backup teams ready to deploy on your signal." The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for the jewelers to walk into it. The charity auction began exactly at 9 p.m. The ballroom's attention focused on the stage where the Pemberton family presided over the proceedings. It was the perfect distraction, exactly what the jewelers had been counting on. Marcus watched the surveillance feeds as Castellano and his team made their move, slipping from the ballroom with practiced ease. They moved through service corridors like ghosts, their familiarity with the hotel's layout suggesting extensive advanced preparation. "Subject 1 entering secured area," the surveillance operator reported. "Subjects 2 and 3 following at designated intervals. All movements consistent with briefing information." Patterson was waiting at the predetermined location, his expression carefully calibrated to seem helpful while actually guiding the jewelers deeper into the trap. He provided the final access codes, confirmed security schedules, and stepped aside as they approached the diamond display. "Remember," Marcus had told him during their final briefing, "your job is to get them to commit the crime. Don't try to stop them. Don't try to talk them out of it. Let them think they're succeeding right up until the moment we move in." The theft itself was elegant in its simplicity, exactly the sort of operation the jewelers had perfected over decades. They bypassed security systems, substituted high-quality fakes for the real diamonds, and prepared to exit with their loot exactly as planned. But every moment was being recorded, every word captured, every movement documented by law enforcement personnel positioned throughout the facility. The critical moment came as the jewelers prepared to exit with their stolen loot. Marcus waited until they were completely committed, until the diamonds were in their possession, until their guilt was beyond question, until every element of the conspiracy was documented beyond any possible defense. Now, he said simply. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Tactical teams deployed from concealed positions, securing every exit and entrance. Federal agents moved through the ballroom, politely but firmly escorting guests to designated areas. And Marcus himself moved to confront Anthony Castellano and the core members as they realized their carefully planned escape route had become a dead end. Anthony Castellano, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft, insurance fraud, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. The look on Castellano's face was almost comical. Shock giving way to understanding, giving way to the cold calculation of a man who had just realized his world had ended. Around him, his associates were being similarly confronted, their sophisticated plan collapsing into chaos and confusion. But Marcus knew that arrests weren't enough. They needed evidence. They needed testimony. They needed to ensure that the jewelers could never reform or continue their operations, which meant they needed the core members to understand that their only hope for leniency was complete cooperation. The interrogations began immediately, with federal agents and prosecutors working to process the jewelers before they could coordinate their stories or secure legal representation. But Marcus had a different priority. He needed to understand the full scope of the organization, to ensure that no elements survived to rebuild what they were destroying. Castellano was surprisingly cooperative once he understood the magnitude of the evidence against him. The ledger, combined with the surveillance footage from the Pemberton gala, provided an airtight case that even the most expensive defense attorney couldn't realistically challenge. We were careful, Castellano said bitterly, meticulous. We survived investigations, prosecutions, even internal conflicts, but we never accounted for a detective with nothing to lose and everything to prove. 23 murders, Marcus stated flatly. 23 people who died because your organization valued profit over human life. Business decisions, unfortunate, but necessary for operational security. You cops understand that. How many people die because you need to protect an investigation or maintain cover? The comparison was so obscene Marcus almost responded with violence, but he forced himself to remain professional, to continue gathering information that would ensure the jeweler's complete destruction. Who else? How many other operations? How many other cities? How many other victims? Castellano smiled coldly. More than you can imagine, more than you can prove, more than you can stop, even with the ledger. We've been preparing for this day for decades. But Castellano's confidence was misplaced. The evidence in the ledger was comprehensive enough to document not just the jeweler's local operations, but their connections to similar organizations in other cities, their relationships with corrupt officials at every level of government, their systematic infiltration of legitimate businesses. Assistant Chief Monroe coordinated with federal authorities to launch simultaneous operations in 3 states, arresting dozens of jewelers' associates and facilitators. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims, hundreds of crimes spanning decades, a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of society. Evelyn Morrison watched the news coverage with satisfaction that approached vindication. Her husband's death, her years in hiding, her decision to trust David Devereaux with their secrets, all of it had led to this moment of complete victory over the organization that had destroyed her life. They never thought it would end, she told Marcus during one of their regular check-ins. They believed they were too smart, too careful, too well-connected to face consequences. You proved them wrong. But Marcus knew that victory was temporary, that organizations like the jewelers were symptoms of deeper corruption that would eventually manifest in new forms. They had won a battle, But the war against systematic criminal conspiracy would continue long after the jewelers were forgotten. The trial was scheduled for the following year, a complex federal prosecution that would require hundreds of witnesses, thousands of exhibits, and months of testimony. But the outcome was never seriously in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. The defendants' guilt beyond question, their prospects for acquittal essentially non-existent. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being a hero, a detective who had solved not just a case, but dismantled an institution. He received commendations from the mayor, the police commissioner, even the governor. His story was featured in national media, his methods studied in training academies, his success held up as an example of effective law enforcement. But the accolades felt hollow compared to the weight of what he'd learned about the depth of corruption in the system he'd sworn to protect. The jewelers were gone, but the conditions that had allowed them to flourish, greed, desperation, institutional failure, remained unchanged. You can't fix everything, Rivera told him during one of their late-night debriefing sessions. Sometimes you just have to celebrate the victories you achieve and accept the limitations of what one person can accomplish. But Marcus had never been good at accepting limitations. His amnesia had taught him that identity was fragile, that memories could be stolen, that truth could be manipulated. But it had also taught him that persistence mattered more than perfection, that incomplete knowledge was better than willful ignorance, that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. 6 months after the Pemberton operation, Marcus received an unexpected visitor at his office. The man was elderly, well-dressed, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to authority. He identified himself as Thomas Brennan, retired federal prosecutor, and requested a private conversation. "I've been following your work on the jewelers case," Brennan began, settling into the chair across from Marcus's desk. "Impressive investigation, thorough, methodical, successful beyond any reasonable expectation." "Thank you, sir. But I suspect you're not here simply to offer congratulations." Brennan smiled slightly. "Direct. I appreciate that. No, I'm here because your investigation uncovered something that extends beyond the jewelers, something that suggests your organization was part of a larger network of criminal enterprises that have been operating with impunity for decades." He produced a file, old, thick, carefully maintained. "During the 1980s, I prosecuted a case involving insurance fraud and diamond theft. Different players, different methods, but the same underlying pattern: systematic corruption, professional execution, institutional protection. The case fell apart due to witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and what I now understand was interference from the jewelers' organization." Marcus felt the familiar stir of detective instinct, the recognition that apparent victories sometimes merely revealed larger battles. "You think the jewelers were connected to your case?" "I think the jewelers were one manifestation of a criminal methodology that's been refined over generations. I think your success in dismantling them has created an opportunity to address corruption that extends far beyond one organization." Brennan's file documented a pattern that transcended individual criminal organizations, a methodology for systematic corruption that had been refined and replicated across different cities, different decades, different criminal enterprises. The specifics varied, but the underlying structure remained consistent: compartmentalized information, institutional protection, systematic elimination of threats, and complete insulation of leadership from direct consequences. "It's like a franchise," Brennan explained, "a business model for criminal conspiracy that's been proven effective across multiple implementations. The jewelers were one expression, but they're not unique. They're not even particularly original." The implications were staggering. Marcus had believed he was fighting a specific organization, but he was actually confronting a criminal methodology that had evolved to survive exactly the kind of law enforcement attention he'd directed at the jewelers. Dismantling one organization was meaningful, but it didn't address the underlying system that would simply generate replacement enterprises. "So, what are you suggesting?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting that your investigation skills, your persistence, your willingness to challenge institutional corruption, These are exactly the qualities needed to address systematic criminal conspiracy at its root. I'm suggesting that the jewelers were a symptom, not the disease, and that treating symptoms while ignoring the disease guarantees recurrence. It was the same realization Marcus had been approaching from a different angle. The understanding that individual victories, however satisfying, meant little if the conditions that produced them remained unchanged. But Brennan's proposal wasn't simply philosophical, it was practical, specific, and dangerous. He wanted Marcus to join a task force dedicated to identifying and dismantling the underlying methodology that supported organizations like the Jewelers, not individual prosecutions, but systematic disruption of criminal infrastructure. We're not talking about traditional law enforcement, Brennan clarified. We're talking about intelligence gathering, pattern recognition, institutional analysis. We're talking about understanding how corruption becomes systematic and developing methods for dismantling those systems. The work would be classified, the hours irregular, the dangers significant. But it would also be meaningful in a way that traditional detective work sometimes wasn't, addressing root causes rather than symptoms, preventing crimes rather than solving them after the fact. Marcus thought about Evelyn Morrison, living in shadows for years while waiting for justice that seemed impossible. He thought about David Devereaux, dying to expose corruption he'd inherited from his family. He thought about his own memory loss, the way identity could be stolen, truth could be manipulated, and justice could be perverted by those with sufficient power and will. "I'll need to consider the implications," he said finally. "I have responsibilities here, cases that require attention, a partner who's earned my loyalty." Brennan stood, extending his hand. "Of course, take whatever time you need, but understand that this offer isn't simply about career advancement. It's about choosing to fight the disease rather than just treating its symptoms. And that choice, once made, changes everything." The decision was complicated by personal loyalty, professional obligation, and the practical reality that his current success had created expectations and responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned lightly. But it was simplified by the fundamental truth that Marcus had never been content with surface solutions to deep problems. He discussed it with Rivera during one of their regular dinners, a tradition that had evolved from post-case debriefing to genuine friendship. She listened without interruption as he explained Brennan's proposal, the implications for his career, the potential impact on their partnership. "You'd be crazy not to take it," she said finally. "You've never been satisfied with just solving cases. You want to understand why they happen, how they happen, what creates the conditions that make them possible. This is your chance to do that on a scale that actually matters." But she also understood the costs, the classified nature of the work, the irregular hours, the danger that extended beyond immediate physical threat to include institutional retaliation from powerful enemies. Organizations like the Jewelers didn't exist in isolation. They were supported by networks of influence that would resist systematic disruption. "I'll miss working with you," she added simply, "but I'd miss working with someone who chose comfort over principle even more. You've done everything you can do here. It's time to do what you're meant to do." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering practical details, emotional implications, and the fundamental question of what it meant to be a detective in a world where crime was sometimes less about individual choice and more about systematic failure. The transition required months of paperwork, background investigations, security clearances, and administrative procedures that seemed designed to discourage anyone who wasn't absolutely committed to the work. But Marcus persisted, driven by the same stubborn determination that had helped him solve the Devereaux case while recovering from amnesia. During his final weeks in the department, he focused on ensuring that his pending cases were properly transferred, that his institutional knowledge was documented, that the relationships he'd built over years of detective work were maintained even as his professional role evolved. He also spent time with the people who'd become important to him: Evelyn Morrison, who was finally building a life free from fear; Leonard Cox, who was preparing for his new identity in witness protection; and the various colleagues who'd supported him through the most challenging investigation of his career. Assistant Chief Monroe hosted a small farewell gathering, Not the kind of official ceremony that marked traditional career advancement, but the intimate recognition of someone who had chosen principle over comfort, meaning over security, systematic change over individual achievement. "You've made this department better," she told him privately. "You've made this city better. And I suspect you'll continue making things better, even if we don't always know exactly how you're doing it." The compliment was meaningful precisely because it came from someone who understood that real change often happened invisibly, through systematic analysis and institutional reform, rather than dramatic arrests and high-profile prosecutions. The morning of his departure, Marcus visited the alley where he'd been attacked, the place where his memory had been stolen and his investigation had truly begun. It looked different in daylight, smaller, less menacing, just another urban space marked by the passage of time and the accumulation of human experience. He thought about the person he'd been before the attack, confident in his knowledge, certain in his methods, comfortable in his understanding of how justice worked in a city that sometimes seemed indifferent to fairness. That person was gone, replaced by someone who understood that memory was fragile, truth was complex, and justice required constant vigilance against the human tendency toward corruption and abuse. But he also thought about what he'd gained: partnerships that transcended professional obligation, knowledge that extended beyond individual cases, and the profound understanding that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible or incomplete. Rivera met him there, as he'd known she would. They stood in silence for a moment, acknowledging the significance of the place where everything had changed, where a routine investigation had become a crusade against institutional corruption. "You'll do great work," she said finally. "The kind of work that matters even when nobody knows you're doing it. The kind of work that changes things fundamentally rather than superficially." He nodded, unable to express the complexity of his emotions about leaving everything familiar for something unknown but necessary. Some choices couldn't be explained. They could only be lived. The new role began not with dramatic operations or high-profile arrests, but with systematic analysis of criminal patterns that extended across jurisdictions, decades, and traditional law enforcement boundaries. Marcus found himself working with analysts, investigators, and experts who understood that crime was sometimes less about individual choice and more about systematic opportunity. His first assignment involved reviewing cold cases that shared characteristics with the jeweler's operations: insurance fraud, diamond theft, suspicious deaths that had been ruled natural or accidental. The patterns were there for anyone willing to look systematically, to connect dots that seemed unrelated to investigators focused on individual cases rather than institutional methodology. Brennan had been right. The work was different from traditional detective work. Less dramatic but more fundamental, less visible but more impactful. It required patience, analytical skill, and the willingness to challenge assumptions about how justice functioned in a complex society. But it also provided something Marcus hadn't realized he needed: a sense that his experience with amnesia, his recovery of memory, his victory over the jewelers, had prepared him for work that addressed the systematic conditions that allowed such organizations to flourish. His personal journey had given him unique insight into the fragility of truth, the complexity of justice, and the importance of persistence in the face of institutional resistance. Late one night, working alone in the secure facility that housed the task force's operations, Marcus thought about David Devereaux, Mrs. Chen, Evelyn Morrison, all the people whose lives had been affected by the jeweler's criminal conspiracy. Their stories had led him to this work, this understanding, this commitment to addressing crime at its systematic roots rather than just its individual expressions. The fight against corruption and institutional failure would continue long after the jewelers were forgotten, long after his own contributions were absorbed into the ongoing effort to make justice more than just a theoretical concept. But he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, using the lessons learned from memory lost and found to prevent others from experiencing similar losses. Some battles were worth fighting even when victory was incomplete, even when the enemy was systematic rather than individual, even when success meant preventing problems rather than solving them after they occurred. Marcus Stone had found his battle, and he intended to fight it with the same determination that had helped him recover his memory and dismantle an organization that had seemed invulnerable. The work continued, the fight persisted, and justice, imperfect, incomplete, but genuine, moved forward one case, one pattern, one systematic improvement at a time. The end.